So today we are talking about how Trump manipulates the unconscious mind. And this is something that you probably were wondering when you probably have friends or family. And you might be wondering, how the hell can they be falling for the utter lies that come out of Trump's mouth? How can they have fallen for this? So what's really important today is that we're going to be talking about not just Trump in general, but the concept of your unconscious mind being manipulated. So while we are talking about Trump and how Trump does manipulate the unconscious mind, and you can see this everywhere as hordes of people sort of fall under this spell and look at him as some sort of messiah, it's not so much about Trump, but just in general about the unconscious mind and how it can be manipulated and how you can protect your mind from those that want to manipulate you and use you as pawns for their agenda. And so the reason why that we're even talking about Trump is because Trump is just such a good example for understanding this. And this has a lot to do with self-actualization, because if you are an actualized individual and you're working on actualizing your higher self, which means integrating your unconscious mind into your consciousness, then you are going to be protected against this kind of manipulation. So we're going to be talking about the shadow self and the power self specifically, and how Trump uses and manipulates your shadow self and manipulates your power self. I mean, not you specifically, but the world in general. How he taps into and manipulates these archetypal patterns. Now, of course, he's not doing this consciously. He doesn't know that he's doing this. He's not smart enough to even comprehend the concept of an archetype. However, it doesn't matter. You don't have to be conscious that you're doing it to be able to do it. And he has done it very well. This is why he has so many supporters, because he has activated and takes advantage of shadow self-projection and power self-projection, and gets people to do his will and follow his narrative based on unconscious processes. And this is why you have hordes of people falling for this, because the vast majority of individuals aren't even aware of the unconscious mind, let alone have integrated it. So what we're going to be looking at today is how to become actualized and make your unconscious conscious, so that you can be very on guard to anyone who wants to, again, use you for some kind of political gain or any kind of gain where they are stripping you of your will and injecting their will into it. So the first thing that we have to ask is, I know that probably many of you are familiar with this, but the first thing that we have to ask is what is the unconscious? Because we're talking about the unconscious mind versus the conscious mind. And while you guys are probably familiar with this, we do have a lot of newcomers here, and there are quite a few people who are even unaware that the unconscious even exists. So your conscious mind is, your sort of kind of your field of awareness, what's going on, what you're aware of that's going on in your mental processes right now. You're aware of your current thoughts and your feelings and emotions and everything that you're sort of aware of right now. That's what's going on in your conscious field. Now, memories that aren't in your consciousness right now, but could be pulled up easily, we might say that's preconscious. You're not thinking about, let's say, the birthday that you had last year, but you could pull those memories up easily, most likely. You could pull those up. So those are your preconscious. What we might say preconscious. You could pull them up easily. Now, your unconscious mind, now that's full of repressed feelings, hidden memories, things that might be too painful, embarrassing, or shameful, things that have been, that are too distressful for your conscious mind to face, and so they get buried. That's something that is filled with your unconscious. But your unconscious is also a vast reservoir for mental processes that run sort of behind the scenes that make everything work. If you think of a computer, or even like your smartphone, if you open your smartphone, there's everything that you can see, right? There's all your apps, everything that you can tap on. That's sort of like your consciousness. If you're thinking about your smartphone, your consciousness is everything that you see on your home screen. It's the things that you tap on, your apps that you can start. The unconscious is sort of like the operating system. It's the code and the processes that run in the background and guide everything. And you're not even aware, you're not aware of the code. You're not aware of all these processes running in the background, but they're there and they're doing it. And that's sort of your unconscious. Your unconscious has all these processes running in the background that directly affect how you operate, even though you're unaware of them. Just like a computer operating system or your smartphone operating system runs in the background, but it dictates how the phone runs. Now, it's really important to become aware of these unconscious processes, because if people can hack into your unconscious, it's sort of like hacking into your operating system, and then they can control your consciousness without you even being aware of it. You'll think that it's you, but it won't be you. It'll be someone that has hacked into your unconscious. Carl Jung says, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will control your life and you will call it fate. So these unconscious processes will control your life. So you want to become aware of it, just like it's sort of like becoming the programmer of your own mind. If you were to become aware of the coding of your own operating system, well, you could have a lot more control, right? So it's about becoming the controller of your own mind so others can't hack into it and manipulate it. So that's kind of a very brief rundown of the unconscious, but we're now going to be looking at those certain processes. Okay, these patterns that run in the background are called archetypes. Archetypes are those certain chunks of code, certain patterns that have a certain role. They have a certain purpose, a certain function. Just like in a computer operating system or your smartphone operating system, there's certain parts of the code that handle different processes. One part of the code might handle your camera functionality. Another part of the code might handle what happens when you delete files. Another part of the code might, sort your photos. Right? You have these different chunks of code that handle different things. So archetypes are patterns in your unconscious mind that have a certain role for you as an operating mind and guide and affect your conscious life. And some of these very, very powerful archetypes or patterns, right, we're going to be looking at the shadow self and the power self. All right, these are very powerful programs, very powerful archetypes, and these are the ones we're going to be looking at because these are the ones that Trump manipulates to be able to get people to go along with his narrative and fall in line and, eat up all the toxic garbage that comes from his mouth. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So as I sort of was saying, this video isn't really a political video. This is more about your unconscious mind, and Trump is just such a great example. So we talked a bit about the unconscious and the archetypes that reside in there. These are functions that run in the background and control your life, even though you're unaware of them. And we're going to be talking about the shadow self and the power self. So let's talk about the shadow self. What is the shadow self? I know many of you probably know this already, but for those who are new, the shadow self is an archetype. It's a program, it's a pattern that runs in your unconscious. And so what is the shadow self? It is a reservoir that you are unaware of that contains all the parts of your ego self that were repressed because they were deemed unacceptable by society, or some other reason they were too painful and for your conscious mind, or it caused conflict in society, so it was repressed. So there are many, many examples of this. Religion causes a great one. So if you are indoctrinated into a religion, let's say it's Christianity, you are taught certain things are sinful. Maybe dressing a certain way, behaving a certain way, sexuality, certain kinds of sexuality. You are told these things are wrong. So even though they may be part of you, it causes conflict, right? Because your religion tells you it's wrong. People will tell you you are a sinner if you engage in certain activities. So what happens is that your conscious mind, because it causes conflict, represses it into your unconscious, and this becomes your shadow self. So every person has a shadow self, and it's universal in that way. However, it's also particular in that every person's shadow self is different. So think of the shadow self as a container, and every person has this container, but what's in the container is different for each person. So everyone has a shadow, and the shadow being unconscious means that you are unaware of it. So the people who have repressed this part of themselves into the shadow will believe completely that it is not them. So this is where you'll have people who actually secretly, let's say, have homosexual urges. They will 100% deny it and never believe that they have that in a million years, and may lash out and hate homosexuals. And because unbeknownst to them, they have repressed homosexual urges in their shadow. And again, it can be so many different things, right? It can be sexuality. It can also be creativity, because the world often condemns anything, coloring outside of the line, so to speak. But it can also be anything. The shadow self is sometimes considered evil. We don't consider it evil in Hyperianism, but it's often considered evil because it goes against societal norms. So it's filled with what some would call darkness. And so the unconscious, or the shadow, is filled with all this material that is you, but you don't know that it's you because it has been repressed into your shadow. And what happens, though, is that these urges that you have don't go away when they're in your unconscious. They don't go away. They're just running in the background. Just like on your iPhone, the operating system doesn't go away. It's just running in the background, but you're unaware of it. So your shadow runs in the background, but you're unaware of it. And so what happens is your shadow builds and builds and builds the more you repress. And the shadow doesn't like that. It wants to come out, and it wants to be expressed. Think about, bottling something up and just, putting more pressure and more pressure and more pressure, and it starts to leak and steam, and sometimes it'll even explode. That's kind of like the shadow. You keep filling it up, and it wants to come out, and it wants to be released. So, these unconscious processes run in the background, and the more unconscious that a person is, the more easily they are manipulated, the more easily they are taken advantage of. And the reason why the shadow can be used to take advantage of someone is because your shadow is looking for an outlet. It's looking for a release. And if someone can provide you with that release, you're going to want to align yourselves with them because it's giving you a satisfaction. This is how addictions occur. If you, for example, those who are addicted to alcohol, not everyone, but some, it might be because of the shadow. Because when you drink, it lets your shadow out, right? You're very relaxed, you're loose. You'll engage in behavior that you wouldn't do. Perhaps that satisfies your shadow self, and your shadow self likes that. So now your unconscious will want you to continue to go to the thing, in this example, alcohol, that lets it get a release. And so in a very real sense, what allows your shadow self to come out, you become sort of addicted to, even if you aren't aware of it. So if you'll notice, the larger that your shadow self is, the more that you will shadow project. And what is shadow projection? Shadow projection is when you project your shadow. You project the qualities that are in your shadow onto someone else, and then you hate that person, because if you hate the person that embodies your shadow, it eases psychological tension because you're telling yourself, oh, that's not me. I hate that person. So this is where a lot of hatred comes out. So an example of this is it's called the scapegoat. Have you ever heard of scapegoating? Well, scapegoating actually is originates as a Abrahamic religious practice. It's actually in the Bible. So what is a scapegoat? Well, what they would do is that they would take a goat and they would transfer all the sins of the people onto the goat, right? They would do this ritual where they would, project ritualistically all the sins of the community onto this goat, and then they would, exile the goat, banish it from the city. Some commenters said that at some point they would even kill it, but mostly it would be exiled. And then so you have the scapegoat where you're putting all of the shadow content, transferring it to the goat, and then eliminating it. And this is a ritual where you are and this eases, because now you're like, oh, I'm being ritualistically eliminating something that represents your shadow will ease you, because it lifts that idea that it is you. And we can see this. Another good example is, again, religion is such a good example. You see this in like the Crusades. You see this in witch burnings. You see this in persecutions of pagans, right? Let's go back in history to the medieval times, for example, in witch burnings, or just persecuting pagans. So you have those who are religious, who are filled with sinful urges and desires, but they're told it's wrong, and so they repress it, right? So people repress their urges because it's sinful. So what happens? Well, they shadow project. What does that mean? It means then they will say, look at that dirty sinner. I am going to eliminate them and remove them. Okay? So this is how you get, persecution of pagans and witch burnings, because instead of acknowledging that they have sin in themselves, that is, they have urges in their shadow, instead of acknowledging that and dealing with that, they project it onto others and then want to eliminate the other to further reinforce in their consciousness that, oh, that's not me, that's gross, I don't stand for that. That's what shadow projection is. That's what scapegoating is. So, what does this have to do with our, talking about manipulating the unconscious and using Trump as an example? Trump is huge at taking advantage of people's shadow and scapegoating. So, you can see this in Trump's condemnation of the other, right? Where he talks about, he's so degrading to, foreigners, people of a different race and things like this. It's because you're transferring shadow onto an other, like, oh, it's all, it's the foreigners that are coming in and doing, it's them. And so this is serving as the scapegoat for those who have a huge shadow to project onto an other and ease their own psychological tension. And that, sort of becomes intoxicating, because you're easing the psychological tension in yourself. And so, and you can see this. This is why a lot of Trump's followers are conservatives, religious, the disenfranchised. All of these people have a huge shadow and huge repression and a huge amount of unconscious content. So being able to get that release with regard to the shadow is exhilarating. And when it comes to shadow projection and scapegoating, the more different the other is, the better. If it's someone who looks different, a different race, a different sex, a different gender, a different culture, the better, because it just further reinforces It increases the illusion that the evil is not what you are. And Trump takes advantage of this, and it's horrible and it's disgusting. So anti, with regard to, you can see it everywhere with regard to LGBTQ and people of a different race and foreigners and all this sort of thing. And creates this other, and this allows people to go, this allows for huge shadow projection and scapegoating where, now I can transfer my own evil onto another, and they're so different from me. In their mind, it reinforces that the evil is not them. It reinforces that illusion. Now, there's this great quote here by psychoanalyst Erich Neumann. And Erich Neumann says, "The fight against heretics, political opponents, and national enemies is actually the fight against our own religious doubts, the insecurity of our own political position, and the one-sidedness of our own national viewpoint." So, it's all of their own insecurities, right? All of their own doubts, all of their own insecurities, all of their own lack. Instead of acknowledging it, they engage in a fight and against political opponents, heretics, and the other. And the more different they are, the better, because it further reinforces that it's not them. And so, once again, you'll notice that many of his followers follow a mainstream religion, or they're white supremacists, or they're conservatives. Now, why? Well, because they have the largest shadow, the most repressed unconscious. And this is an important point to talk about here, is that, so this is how he takes advantage of the shadow. But not only that, okay, he also takes advantage of the power self. So he has these two archetypes that he's manipulating. One is the shadow self, and the other is the power self. So you'll notice that a lot of the followers that he attracts have huge shadow selves, big shadow repression going on, but also it's the power self that he manipulates. And you'll notice that it's the he'll attract those that feel the most powerless and the most disenfranchised. So we talked a little bit about the shadow self. Now let's talk a little bit about the power self. Another one of these archetypes, unconscious patterns that Trump uses to his advantage to radicalize people and get people on his side. So what is, the shadow self is all the parts of you that you have repressed into your unconscious. What is the power self? Now, the power self is simple, but it's a bit difficult to articulate. Basically, what your power self is it's the part of you that is very it's your energy, it's your inner will, it's your divine strength, so to speak. It is, if we're talking about the higher self, it's sort of the fiery core of the higher self. And a great way to understand what the power self is think about people that you really admire. Think about characters in a movie that you think are amazing. Like, wow, they're so powerful. Wow, they're so inspirational. So what's happening is you're engaging in power self projection. What power self projection is when you're projecting your own inner power onto someone else. So when you admire someone and there's nothing wrong with admiring someone, by the way, but I'm just giving this as examples to understand what your power self is. When you like there's character in the movie, you think, oh man, that character's so powerful, so amazing. What's happening is that's actually you. that is yearning to actualize. You're yearning to be that power. That's what's in your unconscious that wants to come out, that power. And a lot of people, instead of actualizing their power self, integrating that power into themselves and harnessing it for themselves, will project it onto another person and then worship that person. And this is where religions start, cults form, and things like this, where this is the idea of when you have someone that worships a god in the sky, that's power self-projection. They are projecting their own inner power outwards onto someone, something, a concept, an idea, a person, something else, and then they are worshiping that thing, that person, that deity, rather than integrating that power into themselves. So hopefully that clears up a little bit about what the power self is. And Friedrich Nietzsche said, the world is will to power and nothing besides. So will to power, wanting to actualize, that portion of oneself. It's extremely, extremely powerful. And again, this is how religions form and things like this, is because of power self projection. So, and when you see, people who support Trump, very often they're the most powerless, the most disenfranchised, the ones that are the weakest. They are the ones that feel like they have no power. Again, like look at white supremacists and things like this. They feel very powerless. And so Trump comes along. Immediately they can engage in power self-projection, because through the medium of Trump, they are having their power self sees that, and it projects, and then they start to see him as almost divine. And this is really, really interesting, because you'll notice, and it seems so opposite, but you'll get religious conservatives and then neo-Nazis that both people like Trump. And the reason why is because they're both appealing to their shadow selves, of course, and also their power selves. So in the eyes of in religion, the religious, Trump becomes Jesus, the Messiah. And then in the eyes of white supremacists or whatnot, Trump becomes the Fuhrer, the dictator. And so this is why these two groups are attracted to it, because Trump has become both Messiah and the dictator, both Trump and Hitler. And it's very nefarious. It's very nefarious. So people are powerless, and so they engage in this power self-projection onto Trump, where he becomes divine. He's not even human anymore in their eyes. He's this figure. And he gives them the opportunity to feel powerful. He gives people the opportunity to become a hero in their story. For them, they're just having this everyday life. They feel very powerless. They feel disenfranchised. Then Trump comes along, and then conspiracies like Q, and then they have the opportunity, wow, I can be a part of something where, I'm the hero now, and I can fight the evil leftists, or the evil, they create this, other. And so, you have the shadow self-projection in the other, in the left, or communists, or Antifa, or whatever, right? That's where the other and shadow self-projection comes in. And then you have power self-projection, and oh wow, Trump is this Messiah, and now I can feel powerful. I can be a hero. I can crusade against the other, and Trump is my divine leader in this battle. So you see how it's so nefarious, and Trump takes advantage of the shadow self and the power self. Now, of course, he doesn't know that he's doing this. He is not smart enough to know that. But this is why it's so powerful, and why, when you see friends and family and whatnot who fall for this, And you go, how could they fall for this? Anyone with any sense of conscious reasoning would understand that it's so faulty. But it's because they're not using conscious reasoning. It's because they are being run by the unconscious, and the unconscious will overpower consciousness and override it, right? Just like the operating system that runs in the background. If you can get control of the operating system, you can control the consciousness. You can control the programs, the things, you know, the functionality of the system. So that's why people fall for this, is because it is bypassing consciousness and manipulating the unconscious in the form of the shadow self and in the form of the power self. Now, if you'll notice, what Trump has done is Trump himself has become a living archetype. And what do I mean by a living archetype? Well, again, we said that an archetype is a program that people tune into. That's in the. But remember, the world is a mind. Right? We know that we exist in a shared dream, and the world is a mind. So Trump has become a living archetype. Well, what does that mean? It means Trump himself has become a pattern, a program, and then all his followers tune into the Trump program. And then you'll notice that you'll see a lot of his followers. They're like mini Trumps. They're like Trump clones. They just mimic everything he says. They become like him. They just parrot back the same things. They become little Trump clones. It's because Trump has become an archetype, and they've tuned into that archetype. They've tuned into that pattern. Now, becoming an archetype is not a bad thing in itself, just like an operating system isn't a bad thing in itself. You need them to run. And in Hyperianism, we want Hyperions to work on becoming living archetypes themselves, so that instead of turning people into slaves and clones, we can broadcast the program, right, the pattern, for people to actualize themselves. And see, that's the difference between things like Hyperianism and what Trump proposes. Trump is a negative archetype in where he turns people into sort of like clones and minions, where what we want to do is we want to empower people so that Hyperions become living archetypes themselves, and then this program ripples across the world so that others can actualize themselves. So it's a pattern of freedom and actualization rather than a pattern of bondage and manipulation. But what happens then, so what Trump has done is Trump has really become identified with his power self. And he doesn't know this, of course, but Trump has unconsciously identified with his power self. And when we're talking about unconscious structures, you don't want to identify with them, you want to integrate them. So there's a big difference between integrating and identifying with. Like your shadow. You want to integrate your shadow. You want to deal with your shadow. You want to integrate your power self. You want to integrate your mirror self. But you do not want to identify with it, because then what that happens is you become possessed by it, and then and this leads to ego inflation. What is ego inflation? Ego inflation happens when you identify with an archetype or an archetype possesses you. And the consequence of ego inflation means that you in your mind become this thing that will no longer listen to reason. You no longer think that you could ever be wrong, that you have no errors, that everything you say or do is completely right, and you are never self-critical and never self-reflective. And, that's Trump to a T. And this is because the ego inflation has occurred. And so there is no critical reflection. In his mind, everything he does is divine and right and can never be wrong. And this is because he doesn't have an integrated psyche. He had, and when you don't have an integrated psyche, ego inflation occurs. Now, all of his followers also, because they tune into the Trump program, they have ego inflation occur with themselves as well. And this is why they don't listen to critical thinking. This is why they just reflect and parrot information, and never think that they could possibly be wrong or engage in critical analysis of any kind, because they have ego inflation has occurred, and now there is no critical rational reflection and no idea that they could possibly be wrong. So this Trump program results in massive ego inflation, because Trump himself, as the archetype broadcasting this program, is ego inflated. And that is one of the huge issues here. And I want to talk a little bit about, we're kind of running out of time just a little bit. I mean, not really, but there's just so much I want to talk about. But let me just talk about, really, so how do you protect your mind from all this? Because again, Trump is just an example. There are many, many people out there that will want to manipulate you in this way. And how do you protect yourself from this? Simple. I mean, not simple, but the answer is simple. Not a simple thing to do, but a simple answer to give. Make the unconscious conscious. Become aware of your inner programs, your inner operating system, so you are the programmer of your own mind. And so then you can't have hackers come in and manipulate it and control you. You see, Trump is like a hacker. And so if you understand your own operating system, you become the programmer of your own mind, and you can put a firewall up. So how do you do this? It's by making your unconscious conscious. By realizing that you have a shadow self, that you have a power self. We didn't talk about the mirror self, but you have a mirror self as well. And by making the unconscious conscious, you will maximize your consciousness. By engaging in integration, you will maximize your consciousness, and then you will be able to take control of your own life and make decisions based on critical, rational reflection, rather than someone hacking in and manipulating you. And that doesn't mean that you can't, that you shouldn't ever, believe what someone says. You should, if it makes rational sense. Free thinking isn't about being stubborn and just like, well, I'm not going to listen to you just because. No, if someone makes rational sense, of course you should listen to them, but you should filter it through reason, and you should have made sure that your unconscious is conscious, so that you're not being manipulated. So it's all about becoming actualized, becoming sovereign, and that's what we're all about. We're about becoming the most conscious, the most actualized versions of ourselves that we could possibly be. And in Hyperionism, we all, the goal should be for everyone to become living archetypes, because there are negative living archetypes everywhere. The world of celebrity, the world of politics. You have all these living archetypes that are programs that are broadcasting negative programs that people are tuning into and becoming slaves. And so what we want is Hyperion archetypes that are broadcasting the program, the pattern of liberation. The program of free your mind, make the unconscious conscious, so that you can become the most actualized, purposeful, expressive, powerful version of yourself that you can possibly be, the most critical, rational, free thinker that you can possibly be. Now, the more conscious you are, coupled with, a strong ego. There's nothing wrong with having a strong ego, right? Having a strong ego is not the same as ego inflation. What is your ego? Your ego is just a sense of I, your sense of I. A weak sense of I will be easily manipulated. A strong sense of I is strong and steadfast. So the more conscious you are, the stronger sense of I, of an ego that you have, the less susceptible that you will be to unconscious manipulation. And this is why New Ageism is really dangerous, because it seeks to eliminate the ego, and which is really unfortunate, because that will open you up to a huge amount of manipulation that goes on in New Ageism all the time. And ironically enough, this will result in ego inflation, which is really funny, because they're all about eliminating the ego, but it will ultimately result excuse me, an ego inflation where you think that you're right all the time, you won't listen to reason, and you're just bound to your beliefs unquestioningly. And so we want positive archetypes that are broadcasting reason, free thinking, and actualization, rather than the negative archetypes that exist in this world today that are basically hackers that will take advantage of your unconscious. And so it's really important. I've done tons and tons of videos on this. Look up on my channel on how to actualize your higher self. There's a playlist on my channel talking about how to actualize your shadow self, your mirror self, your power self. And you know, each one has its own hurdles. The mirror self is the most difficult archetype to integrate. The power self is the most dangerous archetype to integrate because it's so powerful. You want to make sure that you have a well-integrated shadow and mirror before bringing in the power self, or else disaster can occur. You know, Trump is case in point. He's not power self integrated. He's power self possessed. But that's what's really, really important. You see, if you integrate the power self well, guess what happens? Like, what's a good example of a well-integrated power self? You know, in if we're talking about movies, like let's say Gandalf. Gandalf, you know, would be a well-integrated power self. He's benevolent, but very strong and very powerful. Now, what's power self-possession? That would be like Sauron. Sauron is just power self-possessed, rather where Gandalf is power self-integrated. Now, this has nothing to do with aesthetic. Hey, you know, Lord of the Rings is a great movie, and I think Sauron is quite badass looking. I think it's an awesome aesthetic. So there's nothing wrong with, you know, a dark aesthetic or something like that. But with regard to, you know, wanting to destroy the world versus wanting to free the world, you know. But I don't particularly like the way movies portray heroes and villains. Often I think it's very, very one-sided. I am much more, you know, rather than identifying with the hero, I am much more partial to the anti-hero. I think that's much more powerful. I'm going to do a whole video about that on at one point, so look forward to that. But I digress. The thing to understand here, okay, is, again, Carl Jung says, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And until you make the unconscious conscious, you will be susceptible to manipulators and hackers. So, how do you protect yourself from this manipulation? Actualize yourself. Become aware of your unconscious mind. Make the unconscious conscious. Become beyond human. Consciousness is, you know, self-reflective, self-aware consciousness is very new in terms of human development. So, work on that. Become that. Again, I have so many videos on this. Check them out. And, you know, again, Trump is just one example. There are so many people out there in the world of celebrity, in the world of politics. More people will come. And when you make the unconscious conscious, you will take control of your mind instead of having someone else control it and manipulate it. So this is, you know, I can't stress enough how important this is. Don't give away who you are. Don't give away, you know, your sovereignty. Don't give away your divinity. And, you know, there's no God that you need to worship. That's power self-projection, because you unconsciously want to become a God. So never worship a God. Don't worship a political figure. Don't worship a celebrity. Actualize that power in yourself, but do it carefully. Watch my, you know, videos to understand how to do this, so it doesn't result in inflation and possession and all this. But be aware, my friends, and there's so much more that I want to say about this. And I definitely will in another video, because I could just talk about this for hours and hours and hours. So remember, my friends, let's wake up the world. Let's start putting out there that positive pattern of becoming oneself and stepping into one's own power and divinity.